Roman history in general is a topic that almost has a kind of sanctity. When I was younger, I thought that maybe was just out of tradition, out of the fact that because people have been studying the Roman Empire for so long, and particularly the educated class, the ruling class in the past, was to a great extent steeped in the history and the writing of the Roman Empire. And so then it became a kind of a tradition, a kind of a cultural indicator, a status indicator. Maybe in the 19th century, you could get a sense of how much land somebody's family owned based on how much Cicero they could quote. And if you view it that way, you get the sense that it could have been the Roman Empire or it could have been the Scythian Empire that people studied in great detail. What really mattered was that you knew a lot about something that didn't have a tremendous amount of practical application. And that demonstrates that you have a certain amount of free time, which means you have a certain amount of money to spend it on reading old books instead of farming or blacksmithing. And there may be a component of that in studying the Roman Empire and in its cultural value. But there is a simple and stark reason why the study of the Roman Empire couldn't possibly be replaced with the study of the Scythian Empire or even the Achaemenid or Seleucid empires. And it's the same thing that we came up against in trying to study the Goths, and that is that there simply aren't enough documents. It is not possible to study those other empires in the same way because there aren't nearly as many extant documents from them. If you find one historical document anywhere, first you can try to carbon date it, and then you can try to figure out who wrote it and what their purpose was, and then you can look at the text itself and analyze it. And when you have 1,000 such documents, you don't only have that task 1,000 times. The documents also can start to inform on each other. So then you have to start studying how the documents relate to each other. And in the case of the Roman Empire, there are literally millions of them. And it's worth emphasizing for that reason that just Tacitus is 19 centuries old. The oldest Roman documents going to the Roman Republic are 23 centuries old, and the youngest ones are 15 centuries old. So there's a range, but we're talking about a very large body of very old documents. When we think of the Bible, we think of it as coming in our imagination from this misty period of prehistory or something. And of course, much of the Old Testament is older, but the New Testament was written at about this time, when all of this very complex, quite carefully documented political and cultural stuff was going on, centered in that big city across the Mediterranean. So it's been interesting for me to revisit Roman history in the past few years as an adult, and after having studied politics and history in other contexts, because Roman history being a small part of the standard education, what you get is that in middle school, they tell you a few things. They tell you about the Colosseum. They tell you that it turned from a republic into an empire. They show you some pictures of statues, and then they move on to something else. What you end up with is the worst kind of ignorance, which is thinking that you know something when in fact you don't. That's worse than not knowing anything, because what they don't or can't convey is that the history of the Roman Empire is to a great extent the origin of much of European history. And I, of course, do not mean that it's the origin of people being in Europe. Humans have been in Europe for about 40,000 years. And I am very interested in the question of what was going on in the area that we today call Germany in the 2nd century BC, or what was going on in Scandinavia at that time, and earlier, what was going on in 1000 BC in those areas. And this is a very interesting topic to look at, and thank goodness there are lots of smart people working on this today, and they're finding all kinds of interesting things. For example, the oldest traces of the wheel and the wagon ever found were found in northern Germany at a site attributed to what's called the funnel breaker culture, and they're dated to around 3400 BC, the oldest instances of the wheel and the wagon. And another one is the Nebra sky disk, which is this plate-looking thing that's got, it sort of looks like it has a crescent moon and some stars on it. It's about a foot across, and it's the oldest concrete depiction of astronomical phenomenon found anywhere in the world. And that's dated to between 1600 and 1800 BC, so it's more recent. And that was also found in Germany. near the town of Nibra. That's why it's called the Nibra sky disk. So there were all kinds of interesting things going on in Europe before the Roman Empire, and we should do all we can to learn more about that also. But that history is largely accessible through archaeology. It's mostly not available through written documents. And of course, Greek history is centered earlier than the Roman Empire. Homer is roughly the 8th century BC. Aristotle is, I think, 4th century. But when you look at ancient Greek writing, you're basically talking about the areas around the Aegean Sea. You're talking about what is today Greece, you're talking about the Greek islands, you're talking about a lot of what is today Turkey, and then if you get into Xenophon and some other guys, there are some longer expeditions that end up in Persia. Obviously, Herodotus talks about Egypt. But even if you take how most of it basically encircles the Aegean Sea, that's certainly not alien to Europe, but it's more specific, local, provincial, in a way that Roman history is not. When you're looking at Roman history, even when you're just looking at Tacitus, you're talking about the land that is today called France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Great Britain. It's broader in scope geographically than Greek history is. But Roman history is not only significant in the context of European history. It certainly is, and that's enough. But as an example, as a body of documents that can be explored and examined and investigated, that are both of a certain volume and of a certain age. There's a lot of them, and they're very old. This is unmatched anywhere in the world. The possible exception being the Han Dynasty in China, which existed at roughly the same time and was comparable in certain ways. But I have no idea of what those records are like, though to have had the bureaucracy that it appears to have had, the Han Dynasty must have kept a fair amount of records. But my overall point here is that the study of the Roman Empire is not just a tradition. It's not something that we do because our ancestors did it, though that would be fine too if that's what it was. It is the closest thing that we can have in the study of history and politics to a telescope. A telescope is something that lets you see something far away in detail. You can see it as if it were close up. And a historical document can, alongside other documents and other corroboration, help you to see something that was going on in the past with more clarity. And in studying the Roman Empire, we are able to see a point in the past at a chronological distance and with a level of clarity that can't be found anywhere else. And in doing so, we can gain some insight into where we came from, who we are, how things got to be how they are today.